the United States, and the world. If Europe's collapse began quietly, the American outbreak started with a roar. It was loud, chaotic, and almost instantly politicized. Yet for all the noise surrounding it, the truth was simpler and more tragic than any government or media wanted to accept. The United States did not fall because it reacted slowly. It fell because it reacted incorrectly in all the ways that mattered. By the time Europe admitted the dead were returning, flights had already landed in dozens of American cities. The incubation period ensured the virus crossed the Atlantic inside people who felt well enough to walk, talk, and pass through customs unnoticed. When America realized what was happening, the infection was already seeded in every time zone. 1. The first sparks in America. The first confirmed American case occurred in New York City, but it wasn't the first infection. It was simply the first one that people understood. 2 days after London's collapse began, a British businessman on a flight from Heathrow died mid-air during a descent into JFK Airport. The cabin crew attempted CPR. They were bitten. One passenger filmed the entire event, believing it was some kind of violent seizure. The video leaked before anyone understood its implications. A man with no pulse sitting up and clamping his teeth onto a flight attendant's wrist. The footage aired nationally within hours. Most viewers thought it was staged. Some thought it was terrorism. Almost no one believed it was real. Meanwhile, the infected flight crew were rushed off the plane by responders who had no idea they were handling a biological threat. They were treated for traumatic injuries. 2 died in the emergency department. Both reanimated. Hospital security attempted to restrain them. Several people were bitten. Within a day, New York's entire emergency health system was under strain. Within 2, it was overwhelmed. 2. The spread through American airports. New York was simply the loudest warning. Dozens of flights from Europe landed across the country, including Washington Dulles, Boston Logan, Chicago O'Hare, Atlanta Hartsfield, Miami International, Los Angeles, Seattle, Dallas Fort Worth. Each arrival carried at least one person incubating the infection. In O'Hare, a Spanish tourist collapsed in the passport queue. Responders attempted triage. He reanimated during transport and bit 2 paramedics. In Miami, a Belgian traveler died in a restroom, alone. By the time cleaning staff found him, he had already risen. In Seattle, a Danish student collapsed while waiting for luggage. Security initially assumed it was a drug overdose. By the end of the 3rd day after London fell, the United States had at least 24 separate outbreaks, each unconnected, each growing in all directions. 3. Local authorities respond and fail. In Europe, confusion came from denial and disbelief. In America, it came from fragmentation. Local police, sheriff departments, state troopers, port authorities, National Guard units, CDC emergency response teams, hospital staff, and federal agencies all issued conflicting guidance in the first 48 hours. Some departments were told to use non-lethal force. Others were told to aim center mass. Some were told to contain the infected. Others were told to restrain them. A few were told to isolate bite victims until formal diagnosis. Almost none were told the truth. A dead body would reanimate within minutes unless its brain was destroyed. In Chicago, officers engaged infected individuals using tasers and beanbag rounds for hours because the official directive said violent psychosis. In Atlanta, the CDC tried to establish isolation zones in several hospitals. These zones collapsed within hours. In Miami, paramedics refused to go into certain neighborhoods after repeated attacks during triage operations. 4. The first American city to fall. New York fell first. The city's density made it inevitable. Hospitals collapsed within 48 hours of the first reanimation. Subway tunnels became traps. Firefighters trying to rescue victims found themselves overwhelmed by slow but relentless infected individuals emerging from dark corridors. Evacuation began too late, and millions were already trapped. The army was deployed in Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, but they quickly discovered what European forces had already learned. Conventional tactics don't work when killing an enemy only creates another one. Armored vehicles could not maneuver through jammed streets. Helicopters were useless in close combat. Soldiers ran out of ammunition long before they ran out of targets. By the fourth day, Manhattan was lost. Brooklyn and the Bronx followed. New York became the first American megacity to fall, but not the last. 5. The West Coast burns slowly. Los Angeles had an advantage: sprawl, more open space, more distance between clusters. But LAX was a disaster. Multiple reanimations occurred in terminals and on shuttle buses. Traffic gridlock turned into death traps. People fleeing on the freeways abandoned their cars when they saw infected approaching, causing multi-mile blockages. San Francisco fell later but more suddenly. One outbreak on a crowded BART train during rush hour created hundreds of new infections in minutes. Seattle held out the longest among major West Coast cities thanks to fast National Guard deployment and fewer entry points. But within 10 days of the first American infections, all major seaports and airports were compromised. 6. Canada, Latin America, and Asia. While the United States scrambled, the infection quietly seeped into its neighbors. Canada. Toronto and Vancouver received flights from Europe similar to the U.S. Cities fell like dominoes behind their American counterparts. Mexico. Mexico City saw outbreaks shortly after, seeded by American travelers. South America. Brazil, Argentina, and Chile reported cases after European tourism traffic brought the infection south. Middle East. Turkey, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia all received flights from Europe and saw outbreaks erupt within days. India. India's population density made the spread instantaneous once the first infected traveler landed in Mumbai. China. China responded with immediate force, sealing cities and deploying military units. Their aggressive response slowed the spread, but did not stop it. Japan fared better with swift border closures and strict quarantine, but their major airports still saw several outbreaks. 7. The world begins to break. Within 1 week of London's fall, dozens of nations were reporting widespread hospital collapses, police casualties, reanimation events in public spaces, travel shutdowns, government evacuations, states of emergency. The global economy faltered. Flights were cancelled worldwide. Borders slammed shut. Cities burned. Yet some places managed to hold. Some islands closed early, resisting the collapse that swallowed continents. 8. The islands that survived. Certain islands, through luck, isolation, or ruthless decisiveness, managed to remain intact while nations around them fell. Iceland. Iceland shut down all incoming flights and ships the moment news from Europe became undeniable. Arriving travelers were quarantined offshore. The infected never reached the mainland. Iceland remained one of the safest places on Earth. New Zealand. New Zealand reacted similarly, sealing entry points within 24 hours of their first confirmed European outbreak. Their geography and strict border control helped keep their infection clusters minor and controllable. Faroe Islands. Their remoteness saved them. One infected fisherman was identified and isolated before reanimation. The islands locked down entirely. Some Greek islands. Places like Lemnos, Ikaria, and smaller Dodecanese islands enforced immediate self-quarantine. Ferries were turned away. Locals organized militias. These communities endured. Japan's remote islands. Some islands avoided the worst due to extremely limited access. 9. A dying world. By the end of the first week, the infection had reached 5 continents. Humanity still had not understood the scale of the threat. Governments were still promising containment. People were still trying to flee instead of defend. Hospitals were still triaging bite victims like trauma cases. And millions were carrying the infection into new cities before anyone realized. The world was not collapsing in a blaze of cinematic chaos. It was failing in the quiet, predictable ways that systems fail when they are not designed for the unimaginable. The dead were walking, the living were panicking. And the real collapse had not even begun yet. The fall of Europe. Europe's collapse did not happen evenly. Every nation fell differently, shaped by geography, culture, military readiness, political hesitation, and pure luck. Some countries held out for weeks, some for days, some never stood a chance. By the end of the first week after London's fall, the entire continent was either burning, barricading, or breaking apart. This chapter traces that collapse region by region, not as a single unified story, but as a continent-wide shattering. 1. Western Europe. France. France was the first European nation after the UK to experience major, large-scale collapse. Charles de Gaulle Airport, a central hub for transcontinental travel, became a conduit for disaster. 3 flights from London arrived carrying infected passengers or crew. French police responded quickly but lacked critical knowledge. They restrained reanimated bodies rather than neutralizing them. Several responders were bitten. The infection spread from the airport into the commuter rail network. Paris fell in waves. First, the outer arrondissements, then the metro tunnels, then the historic core. Finally, the hospitals. Gare du Nord turned into a slaughterhouse when an infected man died on a crowded platform and rose while medics were treating him. Hundreds fled into streets already infected. Many who were bitten simply disappeared into the city's labyrinth before collapsing miles away. Lyon and Marseille faced similar outbreaks, seeded by domestic flights or incoming trains. In under 4 days, France had widespread reanimation zones in every major city. Belgium. Belgium's downfall began with a single Eurostar train from London. 3 dead passengers were discovered on arrival in Brussels. Responders assumed gas poisoning, boarded in standard gear, and were attacked when the bodies reanimated. The infection spread rapidly in Belgium's dense urban zones: Brussels, Antwerp, Ghent, Liège. Belgium's size worked against it. Outbreaks simply collided until the entire country was compromised. Netherlands. Amsterdam was hit first. Schiphol Airport suffered at least 2 in-terminal deaths that reanimated. Passengers ran in panic, triggering stampedes. Those injured in the chaos became trapped with reanimated bodies. The infection spread along railway links to Rotterdam, Utrecht, and The Hague. Canals slowed some infected movement but enabled others. Bodies fell into water, drifted quietly, and reanimated days later. Local authorities were decisive but overwhelmed. Germany. Germany mounted Europe's strongest early response. The Robert Koch Institute recognized the signs quickly. Federal authorities authorized headshots within hours. The Bundeswehr deployed with brutal efficiency. Green zones were established: Berlin Government District, Frankfurt Financial Center, Munich's central hospitals. Despite this, Germany's interconnected transport system ensured the infection could not be contained. Flights from London and Paris triggered multiple outbreaks simultaneously. Trains carried infected passengers across the country. German cities lasted longer than most in Western Europe, but by the end of the week, Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Cologne were all in various stages of collapse. 2. The North, Scandinavia. Denmark. Denmark attempted an early border closure, but it came too late. Refugees flooded in from Germany, some carrying infection unknowingly. Danish police tried to maintain order but were quickly overwhelmed. Copenhagen saw mass panic near Nørreport station when several bite victims collapsed at once. The infection then spread through trains, ferries, highways, urban neighborhoods. Denmark fell faster than anyone expected. Sweden. Sweden's decentralized emergency structure slowed its response. The first outbreak in Stockholm erupted in a bus terminal. Swedish police attempted verbal commands and non-lethal force, which failed immediately. Reanimated bodies in Stockholm's central station turned it into a death trap. Outbreaks followed in Gothenburg and Malmö. Sweden held out longer than Denmark due to lower population density, but urban areas were lost quickly. Norway. Norway performed surprisingly well early on. Natural geography created choke points. Mountain roads were blocked. Ferries were shut down quickly. The military deployed decisively. Oslo had outbreaks, but many smaller towns remained infection-free for days or weeks. Still, infected individuals crossing from Sweden eventually breached Norway's interior. The collapse was slower, but inevitable. Finland. Finland's first outbreak arrived from Russia and Sweden almost simultaneously. Finnish authorities responded with a disciplined lockdown, but reanimation events in Helsinki hospitals seeded uncontrollable spread. Rural areas held out longer. Iceland. Iceland stands as Europe's greatest survivor story. The moment Paris and Amsterdam began to fall, Iceland shut down. All flights, all ferries, all ports, all incoming travelers. Cruise ships were forced to wait offshore for days. Every arrival was quarantined. Iceland remained one of the last truly safe places on Earth. 3. Southern Europe. Spain. Barcelona's first outbreak occurred in a tourist-heavy area. Crowds mistook the first reanimation for a violent altercation. People got too close, filmed too closely, reacted too slowly. Madrid's outbreak began at Atocha station. Packed platforms became traps. Riot police attempted control but were bitten in the chaos. Spain fragmented quickly. Some regions locked down early: Basque Country, Galicia, Canary Islands. Others descended into confusion. Spain became a patchwork of survivor enclaves and infected wastelands. Portugal. Portugal experienced outbreaks in Lisbon and Porto, but rural Portugal and smaller coastal regions managed to isolate themselves better than most of Europe. Some villages sealed their roads with tractors and barricades, maintaining control for surprisingly long periods. Italy. Rome's Termini station was the epicenter. When the first infected collapsed on the platform, panicked passengers created a deadly crush. Venice suffered an unusual fate. The canals slowed infected mobility, but also trapped living survivors who fled into dead-end alleyways. Italy's poor economic condition and strained healthcare system magnified the disaster. Northern Italy held out better than the south, but no region escaped unscathed. Greece. Athens collapsed within days due to dense, chaotic streets and overwhelmed hospitals. However, many Greek islands reacted instantly. Ferries refused docking. Local councils formed militias. Small ports were barricaded with fishing boats. Several islands remained completely infection-free. Crete, being large and mountainous, held out longer than most mainland regions. 4. Eastern Europe. Poland. Poland's strict border control slowed the infection's entry. Military forces were deployed immediately. Several outbreaks were contained temporarily, but human movement, truck drivers, refugees, tourists, ensured the infection spread inward. Warsaw eventually fell. Krakow and Gdansk followed. Rural eastern regions lasted much longer. Czech Republic and Slovakia. Both countries closed borders early, but outbreaks in Prague and Bratislava spread rapidly due to urban density and tourism. Hungary. Hungary used aggressive, uncompromising tactics. Entire highways were barricaded. Anyone showing bite wounds was executed on sight. This slowed collapse but could not stop it. Romania and Bulgaria. Rural populations reacted quickly, barricading villages and using force without hesitation. But Bucharest, Sofia, and coastal cities fell rapidly due to crowded housing and poor policing. The Balkans. The Balkans displayed some of the fiercest local resistance. Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia. Communities formed armed militias quickly. Mountainous geography helped. Balkan rural regions became some of Europe's longest-lasting holdouts. 5. The East, Russia and its neighbors. Russia. Russia's initial denial was catastrophic. Outbreaks in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Novosibirsk spread rapidly. However, once the Russian military recognized the threat, they acted with cold efficiency. Artillery strikes on infected zones, use of flamethrowers, sealing entire districts with armored vehicles. Urban centers still fell, but rural Russia remained partially intact due to sheer size and low density. Belarus. Denial lasted too long. Minsk fell in a single night of reanimations in overcrowded Soviet-era apartment blocks. Ukraine. Already hardened by war, Ukraine responded aggressively. Territorial defense groups organized quickly, but large cities still suffered overwhelming outbreaks. Rural Ukrainian villages resisted for surprisingly long periods. 6. The Mediterranean and microstates. Turkey. Turkey was infected through flights from London, overland routes through Europe, domestic transport corridors. Istanbul's density made collapse rapid. Ankara held longer. Eastern regions fractured into isolated survivor groups. Cyprus, Malta, and the islands. Cyprus saw limited outbreaks but held out longer than most due to its partial isolation. Malta was hit early, but its small size made containment possible in the short term. Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica became battlegrounds. Some regions enforced naval blockades using whatever vessels they had. Microstates, Monaco fell instantly due to proximity to French outbreaks. San Marino collapsed with Italy. Andorra initially held until refugees overwhelmed borders. Liechtenstein sealed itself early and survived temporarily. Vatican City was evacuated, but Rome's collapse engulfed it soon after. 7. Europe in ruins. Within 2 weeks of London's fall, every European capital had experienced reanimation events. Most major cities were compromised. Rail and air networks had collapsed or were being used unintentionally as transmission corridors. Governments were abandoning cities they could no longer defend. Populations fled, carrying infection to new regions. Europe became a continent of fractured strongholds, roving infected, burned-out hospitals, barricaded towns, and desperate refugees. Some regions maintained pockets of civilization. Some islands remained untouched. Some rural areas held. Most urban centers fell. And as Europe dissolved into chaos, the rest of the world realized something else. If Europe, one of the wealthiest, best connected, and most medically advanced regions on Earth, could fall this fast, then nowhere was safe. The global unraveling. By the third week after London's fall, the outbreak was no longer regional, continental, or even hemispheric. It had become planetary. No country was dealing with isolated clusters anymore. Every nation on Earth was either collapsing, defending, or denying reality. This chapter traces the final stage of the first wave, the worldwide breaking of systems, the last safe zones, and the desperate attempts to preserve something of civilization. Humanity's downfall was not uniform. Some nations fought well, some disintegrated instantly, a few held on against all odds. But the world itself, the interconnected system of travel, trade, medicine, finance, communication, that world crumbled completely. The dead did not conquer Earth quickly. Human beings delivered the victory to them. 1. The United States breaks apart. America entered the crisis with resources, weapons, distance, and warning. But those advantages were drowned by fragmentation, misinformation, and sheer scale. By the second week, several states had already declared independent emergency authority. Borders between states hardened into chaotic armed choke points. The Northeast falls. New York's collapse spread into New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. Boston's outbreak tore through hospitals rapidly. Philadelphia lost control when ambulances brought infected victims from New York before understanding the danger. Smaller cities like Providence, Hartford, and Albany were consumed as populations fled in every direction. Washington, D.C. The federal government evacuated to multiple undisclosed locations. D.C. itself fell when reanimation occurred inside a FEMA medical center. The Midwest. Chicago fell next. Minneapolis, Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis each faced outbreaks seeded from airports or interstate flights. Rural areas resisted longer but ultimately fell as infected wanderers followed highways into quiet towns. The South. Atlanta, home to the CDC, fell around day 15. The CDC's main campus suffered an internal reanimation event caused by a single contaminated survivor who made it through screening. Houston, Dallas, Miami, and New Orleans spread the infection through port traffic and airports. Florida experienced chaos as millions attempted to evacuate north. Highways became walls of abandoned cars. Reanimated bodies moved through them, slowly, inevitably. The West Coast. Los Angeles collapsed in layers. San Diego's outbreak grew from the inland suburbs inward. San Francisco fell suddenly after BART tunnel incidents. Seattle fractured into isolated barricaded districts. Final fragmentation. By the end of the first month, the United States had no functioning national structure. What remained were local militias, isolated National Guard units, scattered survivor enclaves, regions under martial law. Abandoned cities filled with millions of slow-moving infected. The dead did not conquer America. America simply dissolved beneath them. 2. Canada's struggle. Canada fell slower, but the ending was the same. Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal all experienced airport-seeded outbreaks. Canada's vast geography helped rural areas hold out, but long highways became perfect migration paths for infected. Small northern towns lasted longest. Major cities fell within weeks. 3. Latin America. The infection spread south along the same routes humanity always used. Mexico City saw massive outbreaks from returning travelers. Brazil's major cities, São Paulo, Rio, Salvador, collapsed under density and poor healthcare systems. Argentina, Chile, and Peru saw scattered outbreaks climbing steadily. The Amazon rainforest slowed movement but did not stop it. Infected drifted down rivers or wandered along roads built for logging. The Caribbean fractured. Some islands sealed themselves entirely. Others fell within hours due to tourism-based exposure. 4. Asia fractures unevenly. Asia was not one story, but many. China. China was one of the few nations that responded brutally and effectively at the start. Entire cities were cordoned off. Districts were sealed with military barricades. Infected zones were sterilized with fire and explosives. China slowed the spread longer than any large nation. But even China could not stop an infection arriving across dozens of airports and border crossings simultaneously. By the fourth week, reanimation events overwhelmed too many hospitals. The military began destroying entire infected cities to save the population from spread. It worked longer than elsewhere, but not indefinitely. Japan. Japan closed its borders fast. Many airports and ports were quarantined before reanimation hit. However, outbreaks still occurred in Osaka, Tokyo, and Fukuoka. Urban density magnified every mistake. Smaller islands remained safe. Some remained safe permanently. South Korea. South Korea mobilized its military immediately and evacuated infection zones with ruthless precision. Still, Seoul fell to an outbreak in a metro line that flooded several stations simultaneously. India. India collapsed faster than any major nation. Population density, crowded hospitals, and poor sanitation allowed outbreaks to explode within hours. Entire cities like Delhi and Mumbai fell almost instantly once reanimation penetrated slum districts. Southeast Asia. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand faced overwhelming outbreaks, but also had some of the most resourceful rural survivors. Cities fell. Countryside lasted longer. 5. The Middle East. The Middle East broke along lines of war, geography, and rapid movement. Turkey. Istanbul, a megacity built across two continents, fell rapidly. Ankara lasted longer. Rural eastern regions fragmented into isolated pockets. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. Massive international airports became infected first. Governments tried sealing borders. Outbreaks still erupted in densely populated dormitories and markets. Israel. Israel mobilized its military early. Strict quarantine zones slowed collapse, but Jerusalem and Tel Aviv still fell. Iran. Already weakened by sanctions, Iran collapsed rapidly. Tehran experienced massive outbreaks that spiraled into total loss of the city. 6. Africa. Africa's collapse was complex. Urban centers like Cairo, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg experienced catastrophic outbreaks, but rural Africa survived better than any other region of the world. Low population density, self-contained villages, and minimal external travel created natural buffers. Some parts of Africa remained infection-free for months. 7. The last safe regions. Even as continents collapsed, some isolated locations survived the first wave. Iceland, the world's most successful quarantine, zero spread to the mainland. New Zealand, closed borders quickly and aggressively, small outbreaks controlled by military force. Greenland, nearly untouched due to extreme isolation. Faroe Islands, sealed completely and survived. Pacific Islands, some fell, some survived entirely due to ocean isolation. Remote Arctic communities survived purely through natural isolation. Select Greek, Croatian, and Nordic islands. Local militias refused entry to all vessels. Some locations became long-term safe havens. 8. The collapse of global infrastructure. As nations fell, so did electricity grids, internet backbones, shipping networks, trade routes, global finance, medical supply chains, law enforcement cooperation. Air traffic dwindled to almost nothing. Navigation satellites began failing due to lack of maintenance. Nuclear plants went offline through automated scram procedures. Millions died from starvation, dehydration, exposure, and untreated illness, long before infected ever reached them. Humanity had built a world that assumed continuity. When continuity broke, everything shattered. 9. The end of the first wave. By the end of the first month after the outbreak began, billions were dead. Hundreds of millions were infected. Only fragmented governments remained. Survivor enclaves dotted the globe. The dead continued to spread, slowly but relentlessly. The first wave of collapse ended, not because humanity fought back successfully, but because there were fewer living hosts left to infect. The world did not end in one day or one moment. It ended in layers, like a structure burning from the inside out. And when the flames of civilization died down, the dead were still walking. The long night. The first month of the outbreak destroyed nations. The second month destroyed certainty. The third month destroyed any illusion that the dead would simply fade away. What remained of humanity entered what historians now call the Long Night, a period without functioning governments, without global communication, without reliable infrastructure. A world of abandoned cities, burning horizons, and slow, tireless hordes wandering along old highways like migrating shadows. And yet, against all odds, it was during this darkness that humanity learned how to live again, not through heroics, not through salvation, but through understanding. 1. The nature of the enemy. The dead were relentless but not intelligent, strong but not coordinated, numerous but not invincible. What humanity finally learned, too late for billions but in time for millions, was that the dead were governed by rules, predictable rules. Rule 1. They followed noise. Gunfire, shouting, engines, alarms. Cities had been death traps because everything in them made sound. Once survivors learned to move quietly, to barricade with rubber padding, to travel without engines, the dead became easier to avoid. Rule 2. They were slow. A single zombie could be deadly. A cluster could be overwhelming. But they could not run. They could not strategize. They could not react. Speed was the living's greatest advantage. Rule 3. They could not climb well. Stairs worked. Ladders did not. Loose rocks, steep slopes, cliff faces, ravines, all gave survivors natural protection. Mountain regions across the world became population hubs. Rule 4. They decayed. Not fast enough, but enough to matter. Moisture sped it up. Heat destroyed them quicker. Dry cold preserved them, making them brittle. Rule 5. They had no metabolism. They did not heal. They could not recover. Every wound, every fracture, every missing limb weakened them. The dead were a force of nature, terrible but finite. 2. Survivor enclaves rise. Across every continent, pockets of survivors adapted quickly once the shock wore off. Some enclaves were improvised. A school in rural France fortified by teachers and parents. A fishing village in northern Norway that cut itself off from the mainland. A mountain monastery in Spain that sealed its gates. Others were coordinated, a series of hilltop towns in Greece, farming collectives in rural Ukraine, castle-like medieval towns in Italy, island communities in the Philippines and Indonesia, and a few were almost peaceful. Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, a handful of remote Pacific islands, where the infection never reached or was contained instantly. These places became beacons in the long night. 3. The return of agriculture. Modern supply chains were gone. Supermarkets were emptied in days. Canned goods sustained the early months, but long-term survival demanded agriculture. People returned to wheat, potatoes, rice, corn, simple vegetables, hardy fruit trees. Abandoned farmlands became the centerpieces of new communities. Cities were stripped of seed, soil, tools, livestock, and anything that could grow or feed. Urban survivors moved outward, slowly migrating toward fertile land. Growing food meant staying in one area for extended periods, and staying still meant building defenses. This was how the first stable settlements formed. 4. The new militias. Firearms helped early, but ammunition dwindled quickly. Manufacturing industrial-grade rounds without functioning countries was impossible, so humanity adapted. Weapons shifted back in time: spears, pitchforks, heavy axes, machetes, crossbows, bows, long-handled hammers, home-forged metal blades. Shooting was reserved for emergencies. Melee combat with the dead required skill, discipline, and nerves of steel. But it worked. Over the months, communities trained their own fighters. People learned to move as teams, to distract the dead, to strike cleanly, to stay calm. Militias became the backbone of every successful enclave. 5. The cities become wastelands. Cities did not disappear. They became the world's largest graveyards. Every major city in Europe, America, Asia, and Africa now held millions of slow, decayed bodies wandering without purpose. Cities were avoided at all costs, except for one reason: the scavenging runs. Teams ventured in to retrieve medicine, tools, fuel, insulation, solar panels, generators, books, seeds, water filtration systems. These runs were dangerous but necessary. Over time, survivors mapped out safe routes, learned how infected drifted, and discovered how to move between crowds without triggering them. Scavenging became an art. 6. Communication returns. Without global networks, communication dropped to the level of scouts, couriers, radio towers, shortwave broadcasts, signal fires. The first large-scale communication networks rebuilt by survivors were radio nets run from Iceland, northern Canada, Chile's remote mountain towns, a Finnish bunker, several Greek islands. Humanity began talking to itself again. Enclaves exchanged knowledge, how to farm with minimal tools, how to operate micro-hydroelectric generators, how to forge weapons, how to trap the dead, how to build silent walls, how to sterilize contaminated buildings. No government mandated these things. Humanity simply learned cooperatively. 7. The slow decline of the dead. A year after the outbreak began, something became impossible to ignore. The dead were thinning, not because of heroic battles, not because of military victory, but because biology was finally doing what it always does. The dead fell apart, lost mobility, lost limbs, rot in humid climates, became skeletons in dry ones, froze solid in cold regions, and when one collapsed fully, it didn't rise again. Infected wandering patterns also became predictable. They followed roads, they followed rivers, they gathered in cities, and they rarely left. This predictability created space for humanity to breathe. 8. The reclaimed world. 5 years after the outbreak, the world looked nothing like the old one. It was quieter, more cautious, more rural, more human. Large nations didn't return. Small ones did, or rather, new ones formed. Loose alliances of communities joined into federations, councils, mutual defense pacts, trading networks. Instead of countries, the world became a mosaic of survivor regions. And for the first time since the outbreak began, the living outnumbered the dead. Not because humanity had grown, but because the dead had decayed. 9. What humanity learned. Humanity learned hard lessons, and it learned them permanently. Lesson 1. Silence saves lives. Lesson 2. Community is survival. Lesson 3. Mobility kills, stability protects. Lesson 4. Small groups function better than large ones. Lesson 5. Preparedness is not paranoia. Lesson 6. Understanding the enemy is more important than fearing it. Lesson 7. Civilization relies on fragility. Real resilience comes from adaptability. The great irony was this: humanity had been too connected to survive a global outbreak. But once disconnection became the new normal, the species adapted. 10. The ending. A decade after London fell, the dead became a manageable threat. They still existed, wandering ruins, trapped in cities, drifting along forgotten rail lines, but they no longer dominated the world. Humanity didn't rebuild nations the way they had been. Instead, it moved forward with humility. Small communities, low-tech living, local farming, minimal noise, defensible settlements, shared knowledge. The old world was gone, but a quieter, wiser world had replaced it. Humanity survived not because of power, technology, or armies. It survived because people learned, painfully, how to live with the dead. And in the end, after the long night, people found something they never expected to find again: hope.